This reading is about Aristotle, pretty much the philosophy of human affairs, as well as Alexander the Great, divinely sent to govern the world, as well as Hellenistic philosophy and the Cynic counterculture. Possessing neither the vivid personality of Socrates nor the vision and imagination of Plato, Aristotle, from around 384 to 322 BCE, nevertheless has exerted probably a stronger influence upon posterity than either of his two great predecessors, that of Socrates and Plato. Of course, when I took my first master class during the time I was in divinity school, studying theology and religion, I took a class in research writing and communication, as well as rhetoric and the art of persuasion, in which my instructor was the provost of the school at the time, and she had done her PhD in Aristotle. However, I don't mean to detract from the present reading. And again, a contemporary of Alexander the Great, Aristotle lived at the end of the great period of the Greek creative effort and the independent city-state that had nourished the Greek genius. He looked back upon the accomplishments of the past, and in a large number of his works, 46 to be exact, about 3/4 of which have survived, he collected, classified, and analyzed the intellectual heritage of Greece and transmitted it to succeeding civilizations. And much of his philosophy was a continuation of Plato, differing from his master only in a degree and emphasis. He systematized scientifically and logically material that Plato in his dialogues had dealt with only imaginatively and informally, where Plato poetically described the relationship between the universal ideas and the transitory world of appearances in a manner that allowed some of his followers to deny the importance of the world of sense impressions. Aristotle, however, insisted that the universal truths, which he called forms, do not have a separate existence apart from the world of matter. Form transforms matter by giving it meaning and purpose, pattern and character. The object of inquiry is still the discovery of these forms, but this can be done only by first observing the objects of sense and then discerning inductively their universal characteristics or forms. From this follows Aristotle's characteristic concern with the world of observed phenomena. He is a practical Platonist, insisting that theories must be abandoned unless their teachings tally with the indisputable results of observation. Aristotle's extant writings have the merits and the defects of lectures, which they are. They are logical, but hard to read, and they are usually uninspired. Yet what they lack in style is compensated by illuminating generalizations, most of which, especially in his ethics and in his politics, are pertinent to our own age. Concerning the good for man in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle's two most influential works, the Ethics and the Politics, are concerned with an investigation of human character and conduct in order to discover and establish the good life for man. Together, however, they constitute the two halves of what is essentially a single treatise on the subject that he called the philosophy of human affairs. The practical goal of this philosophy is the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. The Ethics discusses the nature of good character, which is the essential ingredient of happiness, while the Politics, on the other hand, describes the political institutions and the laws which can best produce the greatest amount of good character, and hence the highest degree of human happiness. The first work centers its attention on man and the virtues that can make him happy, that being the Ethics. The second, the Politics, looks to the state as a powerful educative agency that is necessary for the attainment of the greatest amount of human happiness. Again, the subject of the Ethics, Aristotle tells us at the beginning of the Ethics that the subject of his inquiry, which must be considered a subdivision of political science, is the good for man. He rejects Plato's abstract and universal idea of good as being too vague and unreal to have any practical value. And then he also maintains that there are many goods. The good for man is a final end or goal, which is always chosen for its own sake. And this end for Aristotle is happiness. Then we have the definition of happiness. The good for man can only be found by observing man's function. The proper and distinctive function of man is the exercise of reason, and this alone can produce happiness. Of course, at the seat of reason is in the rational part of the soul for Aristotle. Human good or happiness can be defined as, quote, an activity of the soul in conformity with excellence or virtue. In other words, the good or happy man is one whose life is guided by the dictates of his reason. Concerning intellectual and moral virtue, human excellence or virtue, or arete in the Greek, is not of the body but of the soul for Aristotle, and the soul has two parts, the rational and the irrational. Intellectual virtues, such as wisdom and intelligence, are those of the rational part, which alone possesses reason and has its perfection in the contemplative life. Moral virtues, such as justice and temperance, obviously known as the Greek word sophrosune, which also is another word for moderation, balance, and self-control, stem from that part of the irrational side of the soul that is emotional, but not vegetative, that does not possess or understand reason, but is capable of obedience to it. It has its perfection in the moral life. Intellectual virtue originates and is fostered by teaching, while moral virtue is created by habit. Then we have moral virtue and the doctrine of the mean. The chief concern of Aristotle's ethics is with moral rather than intellectual virtue, for Aristotle desires to provide for the majority of citizens a practical guide to the happiness to be found in the world of everyday activity. Moral virtue is described in terms of what we would call character. Good character is produced, as has been seen, through the habitual performance of right acts until the power of doing them freely and willingly becomes second nature. But what are right acts, we must ask? Here Aristotle brings the famous doctrine of the mean as the rational principle that can and should guide people in determining those acts whose habitual practice will produce moral virtue and therefore happiness. Acts are right and virtuous when they are means or medians that lie between two extremes. This is the old Greek doctrine of moderation, or nothing too much, and it also illustrates how moral virtue, though not possessing reason, is nevertheless obedient to reason, without which it would be blind. It is Aristotle's words, quote, defined by a rational principle, such as a man of practical wisdom would use to determine it, end quote. Thus bravery, for example, is the rational mean between the two extreme emotions of rashness and cowardice. And then we talk about intellectual virtue, which is the ideal life. And in order to achieve happiness, people must practice those moral virtues that are acquired when the emotional and impulsive functioning of the irrational part of the soul is guided by the rational principle of what he terms the golden mean. But those whose reason is thus only indirectly and partially employed with the practical and moral concerns of life fall short of complete happiness. The rational part of the soul, as distinct from the irrational part, is the seat of reason, whose speculative activity is the highest faculty of man's nature. Only this pure reason can contemplate the eternal truths that are found in philosophy, science, art, and theology, and also concerned with such truths which gives the man who is capable of such activity the greatest pleasure and happiness. And as Aristotle states elsewhere, quote, it is only in a secondary sense that the life that accords with other moral virtue can be said to be happy, for the activities of such virtue are human. They have no divine, that is, eternal element, end quote. And thus the section of the Ethics reflects the strong influence of Plato, and yet even while praising the life and thought of the ideal life, Aristotle still keeps his feet on the ground and also insists that contemplative happiness also requires that a certain amount of material goods is necessary. Then Aristotle also talks about the need of legislation. He also transitions from the ethics to the politics. And at the end of the Ethics, Aristotle returns to his main subject, that of moral virtue, and discusses the necessary part to be played out by the state, whose laws provide the most effective training and environment for the formation of ethical character. This serves as a transition to the politics, wherein his study of the good life for man is brought to a completion. Concerning his politics, Aristotle says that a state exists for the sake of the good life. But it is often stated that Aristotle in his politics was blind to the political facts of life in his own day, in that he ignored the imperial state of the future that Philip and Alexander were creating, and dealt only with the political life of the small city-states whose independent existence was largely over at the time. However, this view ignores also the fact that the politics was meant to be a continuation of the ethics, and that the purpose of the state is to promote and maintain the well-being of its citizens morally, in regard to the excellence of character, and that his good and honorable life would seem to him to be impossible of achievement in a huge and heterogeneous empire in which people could not act as free citizens participating in a shared life. Yet, what Aristotle does write in the Politics remains an excellent summary and interpretation of Greek political experience, and most of all, it penetrates several generalizations on political and social behavior that remain valid and still illuminating today. The 8 books of the Politics fall into 2 main divisions, to which Book 1 serves as an introduction. In Books 2, 3, 7, and 8, Aristotle gives evidence of the influence of Plato as he describes the characteristics of an ideal state, but in books thought to have been written last, which is Books 4, 5, and 6, he puts aside considerations of an ideal commonwealth and more realistically deals with practical matters that relate to the nature and stability of existing Greek states. The conclusions reached in the second part of his treatise were supported by the multitude of facts that were gleaned from his analysis of the constitutions of 158 Greek states. Nature, origin, and the purpose of the state. In Book 1, Aristotle indicates the relationship of the politics to the ethics by insisting upon the necessary connection between the state and man's goals as a virtuous and happy life. The state is not an artificial creation, as the sophists had argued, but it is the natural culmination of earlier and simpler forms of society, the family and the village, which people naturally and instinctively create in order to satisfy their immediate and elementary wants. But a life of moral virtue and happiness, for that matter, the highest of their wants, can only be provided and entertained by the final manifestation of what he calls the social instinct, implanted in all men by nature, namely the state. And so the state comes into existence, Aristotle says, originating in the bare needs of life and continuing in existence for the sake of the good life. The modern concept of man versus the state would be unthinkable to Aristotle, for he said that man is by nature a political animal who can realize his highest ideals only as a member of society. Actually, Aristotle also has a criticism of communism, and he also comments on good and bad institutions, as well as the ideal state and its true object, as well as education, the best constitution, the practicable state, and the causes of revolution, preserving constitutions, and the like. As a preliminary to his discussion of the ideal state, Aristotle condemns the communism of Plato's utopian republic. The nub of his argument is that communistic unity runs counter to both human nature and to the nature of the state, a view supported in our day by revelations of the deplorable standard of living in modern, for example, communist utopias. Think of the former USSR and other Marxist states, for that matter. People are, in the first instance, aware of their own private interests, and to deprive them of these would be to create hostility to society and to destroy the natural tendency to cooperate with fellow beings in creating the good life through the agency of the state. The greater the degree of individual interests, activities, and possessions, the richer will be the individual's contribution to the community. Aristotle advocates reforms by good customs and laws, but he condemns the radical who would disregard the experience of ages in his extreme haste to remove present evils. Aristotle's classification of governments of good and bad constitutions has remained standard for nearly 2,500 years. His division into 6 types is based upon his study of Greek political experience, while his criterion for distinguishing between good and bad governments is derived from his views on the nature and purpose of the state. The true end of the state for Aristotle is well-being and happiness, and this is the common interest. Of course, good governments are devoted to the common interest, while bad or perverted governments place the selfish interest of a ruling class above the common good of all people. Concerning the ideal state and its true object, The true object of the state for Aristotle is neither trade nor empire, nor the prevention of crime or anything else but the good life. By state, Aristotle does not mean country, but government or constitution, and the best states are those in which the rulers are best fitted by their position of virtue to rule in such a manner as to attain the most desirable life. And whether this is to be the rule of one kingship or few, such as an aristocracy, or many, such as constitutionalism, it depends upon the nature and temperament of the people. And in any case, in an ideal state, the laboring and business classes will not be citizens, for the virtue of a good man is necessarily the same as the virtue of a citizen in a perfect state, and these classes have not the leisure necessary both for the development of virtue and the performance of political duties. Concerning education, like so much of Aristotle's writings, his discussion of the central importance of public education is very pertinent to our modern civilization, where state versus private education has long been a subject of controversy. He also distinguishes between liberal education, since he was the first to use the term, and vocational education, and his arguments in favor of the former, that of liberal education, stem from his all-pervading desire to provide the good life for everyone. It should be noted that what Aristotle terms music includes all the arts and literature, or what we would today call the humanities. And the part of his Politics which Aristotle seems to have written last, books 4, 5, and 6, he turns from a discussion of the ideal state to deal realistically with the subject of practicable constitutions for existing states. For he said that the best is often unobtainable, and therefore the true lawmaker or statesman ought to be acquainted with that which is best considering the circumstances. End quote. In keeping with his doctrine of the golden mean, he defines the best such constitution as one that combines the best features of democracy and oligarchy and rests upon the social foundation of a large middle class. This represents the practicable form of that ideal type of state that Aristotle had called constitutional government, and it is often called today a republic, as distinct from a democracy by those who share Aristotle's fear of the excesses of democracy. He talks about the best practicable constitution described, and this was too visionary for the Greeks of his day, however, whose governments were actually examples of the worst types of constitutions, either turbulent democracies or selfish oligarchies, and he therefore turns his attention to these bad or perverted constitutions and realistically describes methods for making them more stable and equally pertinent, lest liable or degenerating further. He then turns first to analyze the nature of the danger that constantly threatened the governments of his day, that of revolution. His account of the causes of revolutions, particularly in democracies, has particular relevance for us in our own time. And how to preserve existing constitutions from revolution, and even how to cure them from their defects and make them more workable, is the last task which Aristotle sets for himself in the Politics. His views on the preservation of democracy are drawn from his observation of Greek politics, and their evident applicability to our present world indicates how fundamentally similar were the political developments of these specific periods in the history of the two civilizations. And at the end, Aristotle returns again to the importance of education. He insists that in a democracy, it is fatal to educate people to believe in an extreme and hence false idea of freedom, which leads men to think it slavery to live by the rules of the Constitution. Respect for law is the fundamental safeguard of any constitution. And then we move over to Alexander the Great. The amazing conquests of Alexander the Great from around 356 to 323 BCE, who in 10 short years brought under his sway a vast empire stretching from Greece to India, ushered in a new epoch in history called the Hellenistic Age. We use this term as historians to use some sort of periodization. But with the barriers between East and West removed, Greek and Oriental cultures met and in time produced a cultural amalgam. The long-range significance of Alexander's conquests becomes extremely apparent when we consider the fact that much of Roman culture was borrowed from the Hellenistic world, Christianity being an outstanding example. and that Rome in turn handed on to this Hellenistic heritage to the Germanic West. To many who lived in the cosmopolitan atmosphere of the Hellenistic and Roman periods, the union of East and West in one world was thought to have been planned by Alexander even before he set foot on the soil of Asia. Various of Alexander's later military and administrative policies were cited in support of his view, the blending of Orientals with Greeks and Macedonians in his army and in his administration, the founding of 70 cities in the east, in which he settled many Greek and Macedonian veterans, his marriages to 2 Oriental princesses, and the encouraging of his officers and men to take foreign wives, the promotion of empire-wide trade by the opening of new trade routes, the founding of port cities, and the minting of a standard coinage, as well as the demand that the Greek city-states accord him divine honors in the manner of an Oriental monarch. Especially significant was the dramatic incident at Opis in Babylonia, where, following his return from India, Alexander ordered the dismissal of his overaged and maimed Macedonian veterans and their replacement by Persians. We are told that he agreed veterans mutinied after shouting at Alexander, "You have made Persians your kinsmen." When order was restored, however, Alexander held a feast of reconciliation attended by 9,000 Macedonians and Persians, and solemnized by the Greek seers and the Magian priests. Alexander himself capped the ceremonies with a prayer that one modern scholar has called a revolution in human thought. He prayed for concord and partnership in the empire between Macedonians and Persians. For example, Plutarch's On the Fortune or the Virtue of Alexander the Great is a youthful and idealized essay written to refute the argument that Alexander's campaign, like the one planned by his father Philip, was intended only to avenge the harm done to Greece by Xerxes' invasion of 480 BCE, and that his conquest of a vast empire was the unforeseen result of chance and luck. But some modern scholars, however, no doubt reflecting the cosmopolitan spirit of our present age, have found in Plutarch's essay much support for the view that it was Alexander's considered policy over many years in order to create a world state founded, as one historian has put it, on his dream of the brotherhood of man, a dream of peace and union between the Greek and the barbarian, or the barbarian, that of non-Greek-speaking peoples, that mankind should contemplate not exclusive national societies, but universalism, the idea of the inhabited world, where all men are indeed sons of one. And of course, some also lend support to the view that more than any other period of ancient history, perhaps more than any other period in the general history of our Western world, the Hellenistic age is much near to our own. And of course, a little bit about Hellenistic philosophy and the Cynic counterculture before we wrap up this video. Soon after the death of Socrates, his pupils began to differ radically from one another concerning the content of his teaching, and a number of different Socratic schools eventually arose thereafter. Plato held that Socrates was a systematic philosopher who created the theory of ideas, the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, and the concept of an ideal state. Other pupils, influenced by the impact of Socrates' teaching on their own lives, argued differently, that he was not a philosopher in that sense, but a moral hero whose character and manner of living should be emulated. And while Plato held that Socrates' pretense of knowing nothing was only the first step on the way to a knowledge of the eternal ideas that were pre-existent in the soul, Antisthenes, who together with his more radical disciple Diogenes, is considered the founder of the Cynic school of philosophy, which denied that it was possible to know anything at all. And while Plato went on to develop Socrates' basic assumption that all education must be political, training Athenians to be either good rulers or good subjects, Antisthenes preached the need to be a citizen of the world, or cosmopolitus, in a new society free of the conventional laws and mores of the Greek city-states. Diogenes, who was an older contemporary of Alexander the Great, exaggerated Socrates' criticism of the values pursued by his fellow citizens and his ideal of frugality and independence of external things, such as self-sufficiency. Frugality in Diogenes became aestheticism. He looked and acted the part of a beggar and of course lived in a large wine cask. And self-sufficiency meant the severance of all human ties. Of course, he and many other cynics were exhibitionists who dramatized their counterculture and scandalized sober citizens by biting attacks on the establishment and by their unconventional appearance and behavior. For example, Antisthenes once wrote that when my body needs sexual satisfaction, whatever lies close to hand is good enough for me. So the women I associate with are exceedingly grateful to me, for no one else will approach them. And like the other major Hellenistic philosophies, skepticism, Epicureanism, and Stoicism, cynicism later spread through much of the Roman world, and as we will talk about the Roman writers, we're saying that all these other philosophies such as skepticism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, cynicism, they spread throughout the Roman world when conditions similar to those of the Hellenistic age appeared. The 2nd century CE, for example, in particular, witnessed large numbers of Cynic philosophers crisscrossing the empire and proclaiming actively demonstrating the Cynic ideal of the virtuous wise man who has achieved perfect happiness by freeing himself from conventional society. Of course, the Syrian-born and Greek-educated Lucian of Samosata, around 120 CE to 190 CE, a rhetorician and man of letters, rationalist and skeptic, frequently talked about the Cynic philosophers that he considered to be charlatans. But in his dialogue, The Cynic, which purports to be a conversation between himself and a Cynic philosopher, Lucian presents a sympathetic picture of the Cynic wise man whose patron saint is that energetic battler against overwhelming odds, the mythical hero Heracles, and who has achieved true self-sufficiency by rejecting the values and conventionalities of society. He is most like the gods because he, too, needs nothing.